So she'd been in a wheelchair for a few years. The muscles that she had atrophied. She had a colostomy bag. She wasn't expected to live that long. And as he prayed for the other elders, all laid hands on as well, the power of God fell on her. And she was instantly and miraculously healed. And I remember she got up out the wheelchair. She was dancing up and down the steps.
Beautiful. Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbert with Inspired, and I've really been looking forward to this podcast for a long time. Inspired, for those of you that are new to us, is basically amidst all the rubbish and depressing stuff that we are bombarded with relentlessly. We want to meet people from different walks of life that have got beautifully different stories, but with the commonality that Jesus is powerfully at work in and through them. And so it's a mixture of stories of gritty overcoming, of persevering, of seeing God's kingdom come through them. And honestly, and maybe Greg, you shouldn't be hearing this, but I can't think of anyone who I know right now who I get more encouraged about just looking at his Facebook feed, because it's so often, it's weekly pretty much, of some stunning story of you leading someone to the Lord. Anyway, welcome everybody to Greg Downs.
Hello, Simon. It's great to be here.
Greg is the director of Kingfisher Ministries. That's the latest thing that you've been involved in, but we'll definitely come to that. But anyway, let's go right back. I mean, I don't know much about your background, so tell us about your backstory.
Yeah, no, so the background, I'm a Lancastrian. I grew up in Lancaster, the county town of Lancashire, and grew up in kind of a working class, broken home. My parents split up when I was 3. Right. My dad was a businessman, but turned to booze and became a fully fledged alcoholic. And my parents split when I was 3. So I grew up middle one of 3 boys with my mum. Mm-hmm. And there was no one who went to church in my family. And in terms of education wise, I was the first that ended up going to university. So quite different from the life that I lead now. And I came to faith through a small church that was at the bottom of our road that happened within the goodly providence of God to be evangelical. So I sometimes say my mum wasn't a church goer, but she was a church sender. So she sent me and my 2 siblings off to this Sunday school. They sent me off to a camp when I was 11, just a boy of 11 in between summer between primary school and secondary school. And it was on that camp that I experienced a definite and dramatic boyhood conversion, and I came back and declared to the family I've become a Christian. Wow. I said, and I think my mum said, "Oh, very nice, dear," as if I'd taken up kickboxing or something like that. I think she probably thought it was like a phase. And anyway, I'm 53 now, so the phase continues unabated.
Yeah. So I was similarly converted, I'd say, between Scripture Union camps in the summer and the weekly Christian meeting at school, Flambards, and it was basically a very coherent presentation of the gospel. It wasn't dramatic for me. Was it dramatic for you in any sense?
No, well, it was kind of quietly dramatic. I think rather than dramatic, Simon, I'd probably say it was very definitive. So for me, it was about the penultimate night of the camp, and the message hit home. I knew I needed to respond to God in some way, but I didn't quite know how. So I remember over hot chocolate, it was kind of hot chocolate, early to bed, kind of quite disciplined camp. I separated from the other kids. I wasn't my usual gregarious, chatty self. Mm-hmm. Went over to a window. It was held in an old English public school, and out of the window was the classic English public school quadrangle, and there was a sort of beehive lodged in the corner, the top right-hand corner of the quadrangle. And as it grew dusk, bees flew around and back into their hive. And at that point, a phrase popped into my head from nowhere, which I've never will forget, which is this: sin stings, but Jesus can take away the sting. That was the phrase. Wow. And I knew exactly, it made sense to me. The penny dropped, put my hot chocolate down, off I went, found a quiet place in the boarding school, got on my knees, and in tears surrendered my life to Christ and sensed the Holy Spirit. I wouldn't have had those words to articulate it then, of course, but it was very definitive in that sense. And I'm so grateful to that. And it was years later, I found this verse, 1 Corinthians 15, 56, 57, which of course says, the sting of sin is death, ... But thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So it was the essence of the gospel, that phrase. And obviously I believe that was the Holy Spirit. That's the first time God spoke to me. Yeah. And so it's very, not so much dramatic, but definitely definitive. And something that has stuck with me and will do forever.
Mm. So that was age 11. Did that mean that school was always, you're on the straight and narrow, plain sailing, or ups and downs?
It meant I was always a Christian. So there's never been a time that I've looked back ever. So I've always been part of the church, working out my faith, seeking to follow Jesus. It wasn't plain sailing, I guess, navigating, growing up in a broken home with all the kind of emotional identity type issues that entails.
Yeah.
I suppose I had a kind of worldly phase during university years, drinking too much, smoking pot once or twice, that kind of thing. But I was seeking to, the old cliche of one foot in the world, one foot in the church. So I didn't fall away from Jesus. I just thought maybe I could have my cake and eat it, and then decided, no, it doesn't quite work like that. So,
university years, where were you, and were they really formative?
So undergraduate first, I've been to a few universities, but first time round at 19 was at Roehampton University in London, and did politics. It was a BSc in social policy and administration. Yeah, I don't remember doing much work, but they were fun years, certainly. And years, as I say, that I was pushing the boundaries in terms of stuff that I could get away with as a Christian rather than being sold out for God.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, having already jumped to university, I don't want to skip out any key sort of lessons through your school days. I mean, I when I think Greg Downs, I think straight away evangelist. Did you already have that evangelist age from the get-go?
I think I did. Often these things one realizes in retrospect, don't you? So I think the first time I owned or had a sense of call to being an evangelist, I remember very clearly. I was at Spring Harvest. It was the Word Alive version of Spring Harvest, which, as you know, tends to be more conservative, more reformed, and not given to wanton emotionalism or whatever. And it was at that particular one, and I was a teacher. So after I finished my first degree, did a PGCE and was a teacher. So this would have been 23. And I remember in the worship, the song worship, I sensed the Lord say to me, "You're an evangelist, and I'm going to use you to lead thousands and thousands of people to me." And I wept. I remember, and I put my head in my hands, was slightly embarrassed because people looking at me, and as I say, the context wasn't given to that kind of thing. But so it was 23, so it's pretty late. That was when I first thought, well, gosh, yeah, this is my call. But looking back, of course, I remember preaching at my mum, at age 15 or 14 or something, sat her down on the steps and told her she needed to. She's from a Catholic background. The house was full of Catholic paraphernalia.
Right.
Catholic chiefly in the sense of that was the religion she didn't practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the culmination of my gospel presentation tour was there was a crucifix, which obviously a cross with the body of Jesus on. And I ripped the body of Jesus off the cross and I threw it in the waste paper basket. And I said, "He's not dead, he's alive." And my mum was mortified by this. She thought her son had got religious mania. But obviously, that, even though it was immature, it was an expression of me being an evangelist. And I remember using the school photocopier. And these are the days when people wrote letters, obviously, prior to email. And I made myself some letter-headed stationery with my address on 35 Regent Street, Lancaster on the side. But then it had this picture of Jesus with his arms open up. And then the verse, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," said, "No man gets to the Father but through me." And I printed loads of these off on the school photocopier, age 14, and used to write letters to people with these. Now, obviously, all these are indicative signs, aren't they? That here's a kid who actually wants to communicate the gospel.
Yeah.
So in retrospect, yeah, I was always a bit crazy.
So after that Word Alive time where you felt the Lord speak clearly, what were the next steps? Did you sort of drift into it, or was that the point, all right, I need to pursue this?
Being an evangelist? Well, I think a little bit, the thing that I missed out, I suppose, was ordination was on the horizon from fairly early on. So 11 got converted. And then, like I said to you, I was the first one to go to university in my family. And so there was no expectation that I should go. And so the plan was that I'd just leave school at 16, like my siblings, like, everyone around me. And so I remember praying to the Lord, aged 15, "God, what do you want me to do when I leave school at 16? Never gave a thought to university." And that's where I had a kind of vocational type experience, if you like. So I remember it was 14th of August, 1984. I woke up in the night, middle of the night, probably 2 o'clock in the morning. I sensed the Holy Spirit with me, within me, all around me. Mm-hmm. And I had this sense of God calling me to full-time ordained ministry. At the time, I was going to a fairly the liberal Catholic church. So I'd left my Church of the Nazarene roots, and I joined the parish church as a chorister. So I was head chorister at Lancaster Priory, which is a sort of liberal high church, very cathedral type church in my home city. And so I was worshipping there at the time. My voice had broken, and I graduated to altar boy status. This is what they did, So I was, used to go around carrying the cross and being an acolyte and all the rest of it. And so, of course, this sense of call, I interpreted it as being a priest, being an Anglican priest. That was the only model I knew. But it wasn't a sense of, I didn't hear an audible voice, and it wasn't a sense of God saying, I'd like you to do this. It was almost God telling me that's what I would do. It was a sense of the inevitability of it, almost as if I was age 70 looking back on my life, and I'd served God as a vicar. And I picked up my diary, and I thought, I now know what my career must be. I must join the ministry. Closed the book, went to sleep, woke up the next day, and I thought, is it there in the book? Because it was such an alien experience, that sense of the Holy Spirit in the middle of the night and hearing the voice of God. And sure enough, it was there. And I immediately put a line through it, crossed it out, and I put not possible. I wrote, crossed it out, but not possible. And the reason why, again, it was the disconnect because of my working class background. My vicar went to Cambridge, Canon Bartlett, and I just thought, I'm not him. I'm just this working class kid. And so I just thought, it's not possible. Didn't tell anyone. And there was this youth pastor guy who was my first mentor, very godly guy called Peter John, still in touch with him. He was terribly old. I thought he was terribly old then, in his 30s, but he was about 35. But he took me under his wing. And he took me for a pastoral walk at Morecambe and a coffee, which he regularly did. And he said, have you thought what you're going to do when you leave school at 16? I said, no, because I hadn't. And then he said, have you thought of going into the ministry? I was pretty gobsmacked that he'd ask a 15, 16-year-old boy this. And he said, well, I've been praying for you, and I feel the Lord wants me to ask you this. So, he had some kind of word of knowledge. And that prompted me to do something about it. So I went to see my vicar. Bear in mind, the Canon Bartlett, this is the vicar of the liberal church. And he asked me why I felt called to be a priest. And I told him the story, wake up in the night, hearing the voice of God. And I assumed that this was, how naive, I assumed maybe this was the standard way God calls his vicars, because, the book of Samuel, that's what he woke up in the night and heard the voice of the Lord calling in the night. Yeah. So I thought, well, maybe this was the way. But of course, I was speaking to this liberal clergyman, and I remember he put his half-moon glasses to the end of his nose and said to me, were you ill? He said in his posh baritone voice, were you ill? And I said, no, wasn't ill. And but anyway, they kind of put me forwards, and he took charge of me educatively. He wasn't a huge influence spiritually, but he was a big influence in terms of educatively and in terms of all things middle class. I first had Earl Grey tea at the vicarage and caviar at the vicarage, but he basically said, look, if you want to be a vicar, you want to be a priest, you've got to do A levels and then university. And he kind of schooled me through that. So I did A levels, off I went to university, and kind of the rest is history. But that ties in with your question. So from that sense of call to be an evangelist, I know it didn't detract from the thing that God's called me to be ordained, and I'd already at that age of 23, I'd been to a selection conference at 21, got accepted for ordained ministry, and so that year I graduated with my politics degree, did a PGC at Cambridge, taught for a year, and I did that just to get a bit of experience, and then headed off to Wycliffe Hall, where I later ended up being a lecturer until recently, but headed off at age 23 to Wycliffe Hall to study theology at Oxford and train for ordained ministry.
And was that a positive time? I say that in the context of seeing some people go off and either losing their faith or losing their zeal. Did that ramp up your zeal? Did it shape you?
Yeah, no, it did. It wasn't so much. I remember Nicky Gumbel, bless him, always talking about, he said the dark night. Someone asked him how long was the dark night of the soul, and he said it was 3 years, but 2 if you did the diploma. Obviously, he was referring to seminary education. He probably wouldn't thank me for quoting him. Anyway, but for me it was, but it wasn't really to do with my theological college. I read the Oxford BA. So I did at the Oxford BA that became an MA. So having come from this working class background and thinking I was thick, I ended up being MA Oxon and all that stuff. But much to the surprise of my mum and siblings, and then had to do a postgraduate sort of certificate in ministry. And that was great, and it served me very well. I wouldn't have done the more academic jobs that I'd done if it weren't for that solid academic qualification. But spiritually, it wasn't super enhancing from the point of view of the theological college. But something was happening in the church nationally and globally at that time. We're talking about 93 to 96, Simon, which was the so-called Toronto outpouring. And I was really caught up in that. So I was an ordinand from HTB at that stage. I was sort of pleased to give me an HTB ordinands grant, and some of the guys at Wycliffe, we got the word that something had been happening out in Toronto, and Ellie Mumford, John Mumford's wife, was going to speak at HTB, and it was in May 1994, and we were be there, we were told, and this day goes down in kind of charismatic history, if you read the stuff. So I was there on the front row when Ellie spoke May '94, and basically talked about what she'd experienced out in Toronto, and she just said, "Come, Holy Spirit." And I remember people began the HTB was very different in those days. Someone up in the balcony in a pinstripe suit, some kind of city gent who I knew and was most unlikely to do this. He started shaking and then fell to the ground. And I was analysing the whole thing, from a kind of sociological, phenomenological point of view. Mm-hmm. And I'd not realised Ellie was moving along the front row praying for people. And so she got to me, and I looked back from the balcony. She put her thumb, I remember, ever so gently on my forehead and said, "Come, Holy Spirit." And I fell to the ground. I remember, did carpet time, as it's sometimes called, and this deep laughter came within me. I was, laughter deep from my splankner, to use that wonderful Hebrew word, deep from within me. I was laughing, and then the laughter turned to tears. And I remember crying for my sins. Which I always remember that, because at the time there were critics, of course, who said, this is not the stuff of revival. True revival is a hallmark by repentance of sin, not laughing. Mm-hmm. And I always remember that episode, because I think, well, for me it was both. I started laughing as I was touched by the Spirit, but then it moved to wailing for my sin. And it wasn't that there was any major league stuff in my life at the time, particularly. I think it was just generally a sense of the otherness of God, that God was holy, and I was encountering the God who is holy, the God who is other. And so I was caught up in that whole move of God, the so-called Toronto move of God, and that profoundly affected me. And I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now, I don't think, if it weren't for that. So in that sense, theological college was an amazing time for me, but more because of what the Lord was doing in His church at the time, nationally and internationally.
Mm. So did you, it's interesting, because I was in plenty of those meetings, and, had sort of mixed times, I have to say. And obviously a whole load of people sort of ran a mile from it, and it's very destructive. So it's encouraging when you hear that for you it was a deeply powerful, holy moment. Did you get up, and were you a changed man, or just further sort of envisioned to be all in?
Well, I think that was the first of several times when I powerfully encountered the Lord. There was another time, I remember, it was in the Wycliffe Hall Common Room, and we had a kind of we used to have meetings called Word and Spirit, which were for the charismatic ordinands. And I remember there somebody prayed for me, and again the Spirit fell on me in power, and I sort of fell to the ground, and I was embarrassed. I was self-conscious, because it was a theological college. People judged you, the more conservative ordinands or the more liberal ordinands. And I remember as I was on the floor, I said to the Lord, "Lord, what are you doing?" I said, and I felt the Lord say, I'm applying my fatherhood to the deepest level of your being. Wow. And I realized I needed, a significant amount of healing there, not knowing, my dad. My parents split up, not knowing my dad, and there were kind of father issues there. And so I think it was a real healing time for me. And so I don't know whether I'd say particularly that one episode at HTB in May '94 was the thing, but throughout that season I powerfully encountered God. That was a time as well. Things were really busy at theological college, but for ages I got up at 5 a.m. in the morning and prayed for 3 hours before the start of the day, and often in tears, weeping before the Lord and hearing God speak to me. And it was an amazing time, and a time in which I was changed. I fully accept there are critics of the Toronto thing, as there are critics, of course, of the Pensacola move of God, and obviously, understandably, more recently to do with the Lakeland thing, because of the kind of obviously Todd Bentley, the guy who headed that one up, ended up in moral failure. But I don't think that negates necessarily the move of God, and all these moves of God are a mixed blessing, aren't they? The world, the flesh, and the devil get in. The world, people can hype it up. The flesh, they can make it up. The devil, they can, that he can get in too. But but in essence, I do see. I mean, John Arnott always used to call it the Father's blessing, not the Toronto blessing, the Father's blessing. And I think it was a move of God, and God was there in the midst. Just Jonathan Edwards. I'm sure the religious affections, which is the 18th century term for what we call spiritual manifestations. And his advice at the end of the day is, don't stop it, because it might be God, but don't encourage it. It may well be a physiological response to the work of the divine in the soul, and indeed the body of a human being. I'm sure it was mixed, and for some people it was other stuff. But I think for me it was a move of God, and I was certainly impacted by it in a way that I don't think I'd be doing what I'm doing now if it weren't for that.
Well, listen, I don't want to go through everything absolutely chronologically, but when were you sort of unleashed, as it were, in your evangelist gifting, and tell us some fantastic stories. I know you got gazillions of them.
Yeah, so Unleashed, it was probably, I think it was that Toronto season retrospectively. So actually it was February '93 that I sensed that call to be an evangelist at the Spring Harvest, where I was crying, and then it was May '94, so it was a year later that the Toronto impact happened. I'd already interestingly had what the Pentecostals might call a classic baptism of the Spirit. So as a young Anglo-Catholic altar boy, I was dragged to a Pentecostal church when I was 18 in Kendal, the Lake District. And I really hated it. Sociologically, it was completely alien from my very middle-class Lancaster Priory. And in the last hymn, I remember just almost trying to drown out the rowdiness of people banging the tambourines and shouting "Jesus, Jesus" in broad Cumbrian accents. And so I was judging it, I guess, in many ways. But the Spirit of God fell on me, and I began to very fluently speak in tongues. So that was a key moment in my life. I became a lot more confident as a Christian, and so on. But I think it was this Toronto experiencing the Spirit of God, the power of God in that Toronto season, that I began to take off as an evangelist. And I became known at theological college as an evangelist. Going out onto the streets and preaching with undergraduates, leading people to Christ, and leading, I remember, the catering staff to Christ in the theological college that nobody talked about the Lord. And and so it was from there that I guess the fire began to burn in terms of having a passion for souls, to see people come to Christ. And then when I was ordained as a curate, I was a curate in High Wycombe, my training incumbent recognised I was an evangelist, and he made me the elder in charge of evangelism. So that was, I guess, my first position with responsibility for evangelism in a local church when I was 27.
And actually, I think just from your Facebook, weren't you there just even a month ago preaching on the streets and seeing people come to faith?
I was back in High Wycombe, which was great. So they got me back to preach at my old curacy church, and I preached at an evangelistic event, and somebody came to the Lord. And then on the Sunday morning, it was an invitational service, and 6 came to Christ. And 2 weeks later, I was back in High Wycombe again, because they did a thing called Love Wycombe. Uh-huh. And Love Wycombe there was over 1,000 people on the streets, mainly Christians, but lots of non-Christians there as well. And we saw 25 come to Christ that morning, and it was fantastic. And I mean, there's one lady came to me afterwards who has been a Christian 3 years, and she said, as you spoke, she said, I just began to cry, and I looked down, and there was like electricity in my hands, and God was baptizing her in the Spirit as I was speaking. There's another lady afterwards who came up, and I had a particular word of knowledge for her about something very specific that happened to her that was pretty, anyway, when she was young, and it was specific, very specific, and she was filled with the Holy Spirit, I think delivered of some demonic oppression and activity that had been going in her life. So it was a great time to be in my old stomping ground when I first learned the kind of the craft of being a minister, or whatever you want to call it. So it was great to be back. Yeah.
So you had a couple of years there. Any key highlights from them?
3 years there. I think learning the stuff of what it was to be a minister, and then preparing for the next thing. And the next thing wasn't parish ministry. I went off to be a chaplain. I felt cool. The Greg plan was to go off and be a chaplain at an Oxford University College, and I'd taken the kids to Soul Survivor, the youth of the church, and God had spoken to me there at Soul Survivor. So I'm not calling you to the privileged Oxford and Cambridge. I'm calling you to the poor, the broken, the marginalised. Right. And sensed the next call was to go and be a chaplain. So I went to be a chaplain of a Young Offenders Institute in Bristol, HMPYOI Ashfield. It housed 500 juveniles between the ages of 15 and 21, juveniles and young offenders. And I was the first chaplain the senior chaplain. So I got to appoint the whole team. I appointed evangelicals and even evangelists across the board. And I only stayed there 2 years because it was a pretty tough job. I wanted to do it for a sort of pioneering thing and set the thing up, rather than stay there and get burnt out. So I was there 2 years. But in the 2 years, we saw 500 of these young men come to Christ. It was the nearest thing, I think, to being involved in a revival in my time, Simon. We saw every week. There were so many wanted to come to chapel. It was purely optional. They didn't have to come to chapel. Yeah. Even the governor of the prison said, "Look, if you want some prison chaplains like all the inmates to be banged up on a Sunday morning to encourage church attendance." So in other words, it's either staying in your cells or you go to chapel. He said, "Do you want that?" And I said, "No, don't let them go and play on the AstroTurf," because I didn't want them to come because they had to come. I said, and he was surprised by this. I said, "No, lads, they could go to gym, they could go to AstroTurf, they could play football on the AstroTurf, they could do anything." And yet so many came. Word got round that people were getting touched by God. Is that we had to do a church plant. So we had 2 services, one after the other, because the chapel was so full. And every week, young men became Christians often were filled with the Spirit, often were in tears. Remember one memorable Sunday, a whole group of lads came forward for prayer ministry, and they were there, the two lads, Yomi and Nick, I still remember the names. They were in tears, speaking in tongues. They didn't know anything about tongues. No one had taught them about this. It was extraordinary, really. And I'll never forget that. That was a hugely formative time in my ministry, more than my curacy, really, because I think I learned to preach evangelistically, and I preached these short sermons and gave it. And I got a guest in from one of the local churches who led a guest band in that led worship each week, and I pounced on one of them each Sunday and said, "Hey, give a testimony." And they usually said, "Oh, I'm not ready for it." I said, "Nope, that's what we want." I said, "The testimony isn't a polished thing. It's like a witness in a court of law. It's supposed to be organic and rough and ready." And so they gave a testimony on the hoof, and then I preach, maybe 20 minutes or something like that, and we saw people. I say every a week didn't go by when we didn't see people come to Christ. It was an absolutely extraordinary time.
Amen. So it must have been hard to let go of in a way, wasn't it, to move on? But you're recognizing you were going to burn out?
It was. I don't think I felt close to burnout. I think when I took the job, I thought to myself, I saw my role as kind of apostolic, if I dare use that word, to go in, to set the thing up, and then move on. And it was so intense. I think I was just aware that I met a lot of these prison chaplains who went through the motions, because it was such an intense environment. Dealing with sex offenders and people who've done murder and all kinds of stuff. And I didn't want that to happen. So my head got turned because I saw a job advertised as tutor in evangelism at London Bible College, as it was called. And I applied for that, and they appointed me. That was my first lectureship, aged 30. But I remember at the time, John Stott was my mentor, and he didn't want me to leave. And his mentoring advice was to stay. And his argument was, gosh, Greg, loads of people could do the lecturing job at LBC, but few people could do or would do the job at the prison, and I didn't listen to his advice. I'm sad to say, perhaps, but anyway, I moved on. The amazing thing was the governor at the time was the first governor was a Christian who appointed me, but then he left. So by the time I left, it was another governor of the prison who wasn't a Christian, and he begged me to stay. And he said, when I went in to give my resignation, he said, "Name your price." And I said, "Well, there's no price. I'm going off. I'd accepted this job as a lecturer." And then he said, "Well, okay, what about doing a sideways switch? We'll put you on the governor training program." And the deputy governor started at £50,000 a year then, which was a huge amount of money in 2001. But I just laughed. I was flattered that he wanted it. But he was so impressed with what the chaplaincy had done. And one of the things that happened is recidivism, as you probably know, is the technical term in criminal theory, which is to break the level of reoffending. The level of reoffending amongst young offenders used to be about 56%, amongst older prisoners was about 70%. So reoffending, and so there was, even at young offender level, 56% would reoffend and come back in the prison estate, and by the time they were 50, 60, they'd be stuck in the prison estate, and stuff. And a woman who was doing an MA in criminology at Bristol University said, could she, because they'd heard about all these people coming to faith at the prison, could she do an MA dissertation? Could her thesis be doing a case study based at Ashfield Prison on whether actually religious faith worked? Now I agreed, and to be honest, I was a bit nervous, thinking, "Oh gosh, what if it doesn't work?" Anyway, thankfully, I've still got the report somewhere, and it basically recidivism went right down. All the young guys that she interviewed, the ones who'd come to faith through the prison chaplaincy, the chance of them reoffending went right down. Now it didn't go completely. Of course, it didn't. You wouldn't expect it to go to zero, but it did. There was a significant decline. And the prison knew that. So I remember there was one occasion, there was one of the deputy governors who was, again, not a Christian. He came into my office and said, "Look, I don't know what you're doing with these guys. I don't know what you're saying to them, but keep it up because it works." And so it was the classic Acts of the Apostles thing, where we had real favour with the secular establishment of the prison, which was great.
Absolutely wonderful. LBC years then? Any significant stories?
Yeah, the LBC years. So I was there 3 years. That was my first go at lecturing. I lectured on the BA, the BTH degree, and that was fun, just growing in the theology of evangelism. I guess by nature, fairly intuitively, I was a reflective practitioner, but I guess this was learning the theology of evangelism and mission and apologetics more at degree level. But obviously it's applied theology and seeking to teach the students and release the students in mission. So as well as teaching at a BTH level, I took students on missions all over the place, to the Philippines, to different parts of Africa, parish missions in England, I remember, or missions based in England, the Isle of Man, all over the place. And each time, we saw people we saw people come to Christ. For many of the students, that was the first time they'd seen people come to Christ. Some of them, of course, had the privilege of leading people to Christ, which they'd never done before. That was a really exciting thing. I remember there's one mission that we did, which was to Lundy Island. Lundy Island is a tiny little island off in the Bristol Channel. I found out there's a tiny little church there called St Helena's. The only population of the island are people who go and stay in these National Trust properties. And there's a bar called the Morisco Tavern. That's all there is, in a shop. And so they gave me permission and the students to take services in the chapel, which we think we did Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. And we advertised it down the Morisco Tavern. And every night we did personal evangelism down the Morisco Tavern. We went down and had beers with all the locals, and I say they're all there because there's nothing else to do on this island, this granite outcrop in the middle of the Bristol Channel. We shared the gospel with them. And they came to church. Not all of them, of course, but a clutch of them came to church, our tiny little congregation where we preached the gospel Tuesday, Thursday, I think, and Sunday. And people came to Christ. It was wonderful to see. And we call that retreat to advance, because there's plenty of time to press on into God and get to know the Lord more. And then, of course, do personal evangelism at night in the bar, and then proclamation evangelism I did in the church, and they were there. I mean, that was great. That was a fun and creative one. Another memorable one was the Philippines. We went to work for a church called the Happy Church in Mindanao. The Happy Church was a big church of, 10,000, I think it was, in a place called Azamas City. And the pastor was a lady called Elvie Go. So this lady was pastor of this church of 10,000. She was clearly apostolic. And I remember I asked her about the whole women's ordination thing, thinking that she'd be able to give a good kind of apologetic for females in these positions. And I remember she said to me, "Oh, I don't really believe that I should be here." But she said there was a man I gave the church to. She grew the church as the apostolic evangelist. She gave it to a man who then basically tried to push her out. Typical bad male leadership. So she had no choice but to take it back again. But she was an amazing, godly woman. And I remember once she showed us Mindanao, the island of Mindanao. It's the bit of the Philippines that has insurgent jihadism. It then still does. Many Christians are killed. It's very Islamic, but obviously there's a jihadist element there too. And she showed me this book of remembrance, and basically it was when members of the church got killed by jihadists for being Christians, they take photographs of them and put them in this book. And then literally, I mean, the photographs was one, someone had been gunned down, and they took a photograph of his bullet-riddled body and then put it in the book. Someone was hanging there, and they took a photo while he was hanging, slapped it in the book. And I was in shock. They showed me this book, and they kept this book as a book of remembrance to people who'd given their life for the gospel. And then they had a prayer meeting each morning, of course, at about 5 a.m. And so me and the students, thought, we don't want to go to 5 and pray. And we prayed at 5 o'clock, and there was such power in their prayers, you can imagine. And they sang, it was a line from a psalm over and over again, "With the Lord on my side, I shall not fear. What can mortal man do to me?" And I remember they sang it again and again with great joy and great gusto. And my mind went back to these awful pictures in the book. And I thought, well, that's what mortal man can do. He can kill you. He can riddle you with bullets. He can hang you. And they weren't ignorant of that. What they were saying, of course, they weren't saying nothing can happen to me. They were saying nothing. What can mortal man do to me? What they meant is that not that man couldn't kill the body, but of course man had no power to kill the soul. Only the Almighty would have power to do that, and nothing could separate us from them, from the love of God in Christ Jesus. So that was a significant time for me personally, let alone the students.
Yeah, very challenging. Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm loving the response we're getting from across the world. It's just wonderful to see how encouraging and inspiring it is being and hitting the spot. Listen, if you are being blessed by it, I'd love it. Basically, this happens under the auspices of our ministry, Great Lakes Outreach, which works in the poorest and the hungriest country in the world, which is Burundi. We're having an incredible impact in the toughest of circumstances. We want to carry on supporting those local folks doing a great job. So if you wanted to, greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. You could make a donation there. I'd so appreciate it. Also, it's word of mouth, isn't it? So gossip these podcasts to other people, get them to subscribe, give us a great review. Absolutely wonderful. So grateful to you. So that's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. If you want to do a monthly, a couple of quid a month, or a one-off donation, we'd be incredibly grateful. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. Have you seen much sort of the obviously miraculous? I'm not talking conversion. Obviously, conversion is a miracle in itself. But have you seen lots of the miraculous in your ministry?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think not a resurrection, Simon. I do believe that resurrections happen today. I've not seen one of those, but most other things. In terms of, I think deliverance is is a kind of miraculous thing. Seen a fair bit of that, and of course, healing. There was just a few weeks ago a missionary came to see me in my kitchen here at Whitney, and this guy was riddled with eczema. It all flared up badly. He said, "Would you pray for me, anoint me with oil?" And I did. And he messaged me afterwards and said, from that time, it kind of froze. It kind of went in, stopped flaring up, so to speak, and then went into reverse. His skin began to clear up. So seen a good deal of healing. My old mum, my old mother, bless her, she's 87, and she's never quite made the transition to church.
Mm-hmm.
But I sometimes joke that she's been born again so many times she's got 6 belly buttons. I've led her to Christ loads of times.
Right.
One of the times with her, I was in America doing something or other, and she fell and she'd hurt her leg really badly and was in pain and on a walking stick. And I prayed for her, and she was instantly healed over the phone, 6,000 miles away. I was in California, I think. And then she told her friends about that, and through that, some of her friends came to Christ. And obviously, as you know, I don't need to tell you, this is your territory, not mine. I've only ever done short-term mission trips to the African continent, unlike you who've been there. But there's an open heaven in many ways. There's atheism that doesn't really exist there, does it, on the continent? There's a supernaturalist worldview, for good and ill, as in not just a Judeo-Christian worldview, but all kinds of other things competing with it. But the Enlightenment, it's almost like we don't have the post-Enlightenment skepticism, cynicism there. And so, because currency is the faith not by which we're saved, but by which God does stuff, not surprisingly, there are signs of wonders happen there with greater frequency. And so, obviously, on various trips to the African continent, I've seen remarkable healings.
One particular healing miracle that stands out was when I was a curate in High Wycombe, so when I was 27 that time, and there was a lady in the church there called Diane Baxter, and she had a thing called galloping MS, multiple sclerosis. As such, she'd been in a wheelchair for a few years. The muscles that she had atrophied. She had a colostomy bag. She wasn't expected to live that long, and there were fairly regular meetings where the elders gathered to pray for her for healing, to anoint her with oil. And there was one particular occasion, we had a mission link partner called Mary,
mm-hmm.
and there was a remarkable man called George Katieki Tusimi, who was this Ugandan pastor who was working with her in Kenya. And we'd flown him to High Wycombe, and he'd been there for the weekend. And he'd been ministering, and afterwards there was a prayer ministry line. Lots of people went up for prayer. And Diane came, she literally in her wheelchair for prayer. And he prophesied and said, you're going to be healed, but not now. But God is going to heal you, but not now. And well, you can imagine the elders were not too chuffed with this. They actually thought, gosh, this is hope deferred makes the heart sick, and all that. And they thought to themselves, either pray for her and get her healed, but don't do that.
Yeah.
And anyway, so I remember there's a bit of a rumpus. Anyway, George went off and went back to Africa, and he came back on a different mission trip, maybe 6 months later, something like that. And he was at one of the midweek meetings specifically to pray for Diane Baxter. And as he prayed for the other elders, all laid hands on as well, the power of God fell on her. And she was instantly and miraculously healed. And I remember she got up out the wheelchair. She was dancing up and down the steps. She had no movement before. She was horse riding. She loved horse riding, hadn't been for years. She went horse riding just days later. She went to see the doctor. The colostomy had reversed itself.
Wow.
Incredibly, the muscles had restored. And it was one of those ones where the clinician said, look, we have no explanation for this. This is of the stuff, miraculous kind of stuff. They had no explanation. She's still alive. She got ordained in the end, and is an evangelist herself, not surprisingly. And, so she didn't die. That was years and years ago. So that was one to remember.
Have you, because you've done so much over the years, have you been through some really lean patches?
Oh, yes. Yeah, exactly. Lean. It's good to ask. It's good to ask that too, isn't it? Because, I think the danger of a thing like this is you can just think, people are walking on Miracle Street and, everything's fine and dandy. There have been the lean patches. Particularly, there was a time where, and this is kind of public knowledge now, but I was on the staff of a big church where there was a bit of a rumpus on the church leadership team. And I felt the need to leave the church leadership team, and off I went down to Cornwall. And it was a time I was pretty disillusioned and beaten up with ministry, I think, because I'd left the ministry team of this large church, and for the first time in my life, we moved down to Cornwall. This was the time in Cornwall, and the first time in my life, how long ago was this now? Gosh, 16, 17 years ago. For the first time ever in my life, I began to have or entertain some foundational doubts And foundational doubts, our secondary doubts, I think, are to do with the church, which I think most Christians have from time to time. If they don't, I wonder, what kind of church are they in? But primary doubts, obviously, to do with, the existence of God Himself. And I'd never had those foundational doubts. I know Christians who do, but I'd never had those and I did. I began to have some foundational doubts about God. And I stopped praying. That was a mistake. I didn't stop going to church, but I stopped praying, which was not good. And I remember even wrote a poem at the time called Confessions of an Agnostic Evangelist, and I'd seen so much. I think by that stage, I'd been into the thousands that I'd led. So that prophetic word from God to me at 23 had already come true by that stage. Thousands coming to Christ, and I began to have these doubts. And I remember J. John, a good friend of mine, he runs a retreat every year for a group of about 12, 13 guys, his kind of sort of his close associates. And I really didn't want to go this year, and I did. And I remember there was a guy called Teo Adeyemi who spoke, who was a leader of a black majority church in London. And this guy, he basically gave this amazing, he stopped in the middle of his talk. He broke off and he said, there's somebody here who's really beaten up with ministry, and and he prophesied very specifically into the thing, and he said, it's like your ministry, it's gone to the bottom of a lake, like the axe head, in the book of King. And he said, and it's covered in silt, and it's coming out to the top of the lake. And he said, God says to you, pick it up, pick it up, pick it up. And I did. I remember the Spirit of God fell on me very, very powerfully. I began to weep. I even though I'd forgiven the people involved to do with this thing that had gone wrong, it's almost like it hadn't taken, but it did take. It was almost as if God forgave the people through me rather than me forgiving the people through Christ. I know theologically that doesn't make sense, but it was like a weight lifted off me. I remember the grass seemed greener, the sky seemed bluer, and I refer to, if I ever write a book of all this stuff, I'd refer to that as my second conversion. Now, I don't believe it was my second conversion, in that if I died, I think the grace of God was sufficient, and I think I'd have been in glory. But actually, it was so significant, this experience to me. It was like a second conversion, and from that moment, I don't know. I did. Yeah, God did a work of healing and deliverance in me, I think, and the kind of the doubt, the oppression, whatever it was that was on me, completely went away, and there's never returned since. And so that that's a pretty lean time, isn't it? In terms of and it just goes to show none of us are immune from these things. That's right.
Well, I mean, that's really helpful and healthy to give that as a counterbalance to all the glory stories, isn't it? Because that is the reality. You mentioned J. John. The last time we saw each other was at J. John's Evangelist Conference just 2 months before lockdown. So it's January 2020, and you gave a stunning word, and then we met up in the swimming pool, and you don't mind me saying to you, but you had quite substantial moobs, and you're a big lad, and I think I challenged you, didn't I? I said that you're extremely gifted, but there's one area that's clearly not in submission or under control, and that is to do with your weight. Now, what came out of that? And I don't think I was the only person. I think you said later that another person challenged you on it, but just tell us what came out of that, because it was really beautiful.
Yeah. No, the weight thing, I think I've always struggled with my weight. I remember even when I worked as John Stott's study assistant, I was by no means very overweight then, but I was getting overweight then. And I remember he had this secretary. He used to call her my omnicompetent secretary, Frances White. And she took me aside once, and she said, "Greg, you're getting fat." She said, "You need to lose weight." She said, "John thinks John doesn't like fat clergy. He thinks they're a bad witness." I remember she said that to me. So things have been said over the years, but I think when at that particular conference, I was probably at my largest. I'd sort of, I was pretty big. And you said that, and there was actually J. John's, the chair of trustees of J. John's trust, Philo Trust, took me aside and said the same thing. So I think I thought, hey, I think this is probably the Lord speaking. And I think then a big thing happened, of course, was COVID. It was literally just weeks after that we went into COVID.
Yeah.
And it was at that time that that was, if yours was the kind of prophetic, instigation, you saying that to me. I think the motivation was COVID, because my wife's a doctor, and she said, in the early days, people were dying, and more obesity was a comorbidity factor.
Yeah.
And Boris Johnson nearly died. He came close to going on a ventilator, and he'd lost 2 or 3 stone after that. I think he's put it back on since. Anyway, so that was the motivating factor. And Tammy said to me, "Look, you really have got to slim down. This could be a health, a risk, life risk factor, in terms of, and so that was the motivation. And whereas a lot of people during COVID and lockdown, they went up in weight, I went the opposite way. I first of all discovered exercise, and then intermittent fasting, half portions, and then even more exercise. And I've slimmed down. So yeah, I don't mind you saying that at all, Simon, because it's funny, because I repeated to one or two people what you'd said. I remember you swam over to me. It was in the hotel pool. You swam over to me and said what you said, and I repeated it to one or two people, and they were almost offended on my behalf. And I said, weren't you offended? And I said, well, no. I said, I think because I speak my mind myself. I always admire people who speak their mind.
Faithful are the wounds of a friend, hopefully.
Well, faithful are the wounds of a friend, yeah. And someone said to me once that the gift of the evangelist is not giving a damn. And, I think you have that in spades.
And go on, tell us. It was 30. I mean, you said it's 5 stone. I just checked online. You lost 5 stone. That is just shy of 32 kilograms, which is what, 68 pounds for Americans. I mean, that is a huge amount. I mean, that's like not carrying around an extra suitcase, however many heartbeats that your heart's going to be given a break on. So hopefully we've got you another 5 years of ministry before you I mean,
maybe more.
Yeah, maybe
more. My doctor wife used to say, gosh, Greg, if you die before you're 60, a lot of people will be very sad, but nobody will be surprised. That was her shock and awe trick.
Yeah.
But now, she thinks there's no reason my life expectancy can't be average, which is, or above average. Average, as you know, for a man now, it's 79, 81 for a woman. I think it is something like hovering around there. But I feel fit as a fiddle. I did a third of the Camino, which is 125 miles.
Yeah, go on, tell us about that, because 135 miles, that's what you did?
125 miles in 9 days.
Okay, and you did that with our very good mutual mate Alex Bunn, and again, I just loved it, folks. Yeah. Because how many? I mean, you just filmed the stories, or Alex filmed you and the stories of. Did you lead during that 9 days? Did you lead? Was it 42 people?
42 came
to Christ. Unbelievable! Go on, give us a couple of those stories.
So the Camino, just to say what it is, it's this ancient pilgrimage site in northern Spain, and to the city of Santiago, which is by tradition where St. James was buried. But it's become super popular in recent years with not just Christians, but with all kinds of people, particularly, dare I say, New Age seekers and atheists and agnostics, all kinds of people like that. And when Alex asked me to do it, I said no. Alex Bunn said he was going to do it with another mate who's a vicar, and I said no. And then I felt the Lord speak to me, Simon. I felt the Lord say, do it as a mission, because and I researched it, and I realised, gosh, all these people who are seekers are there. So I did it, and I wore my clerical collar every day, and a pectoral cross around me. And this facilitated lots of conversations with all kinds of people. And the reason it was 42, there was some by conversations. Like there was a New Age couple that I met who I spoke to all day. I was literally doing apologetics with them all day. They were so far back. I answered they had question after question after question about Christianity. And then we stopped and we had dinner in a bar. And I said, look, do you want to give your life to Christ? And they did. And I baptized them in the bar.
Beautiful.
And they were filled with the Holy Spirit. They were crying. It was wonderful. There was another one where there was like a gazebo that had been put up by a group of pilgrims who were all kind of under this gazebo thing. And they were all from a Catholic background. They didn't know each other before they came on it. And the reason why, they saw the clerical collar and they waved at me and they say, hey, padre, hey, which is father. And they come across and they said, have a drink, join in the picnic, And so, so I found out, where they were. So, how much of you are genuine believing Catholics, and whatever, and many of them, of course, said they were not just cultural Catholics, or they didn't go to church. I think 2 or 3 of them said that they were believing Catholics, out of the group of maybe 20. And anyway, and then one of them said, "Father, would you give us your blessing?" So what they wanted was a priest's blessing. Now, this is where I've changed. Years ago, I'd have, as a Protestant, I'd have thought, no, I'm not going to give them my blessing. Now I think, well, gosh, what harm could it possibly do by blessing people in the name of the triune God? But of course, what I didn't do is just give them money. I said, I'm very happy to give you a blessing. I said, but first, would you like to hear a Camino homily? Obviously from the Greek homiletikos, which is a short discourse, And they all said, oh yes. They all sat down. So all 20 of them, they all sat down with their glasses of wine, and I stood up there, and I was translated into Spanish, of course, and I shared the gospel. I said, religion. It's not about religion, it's about relationship. And I said, I go around the world, and people sometimes define Christianity in sectarian terms, whether you're a Catholic or an Anglican or whatever. And I said, no, it's really neat. Anyway, whatever. I shared the gospel, and then, of course, gave an appeal. Said, here's a prayer of commitment for any. And many of them prayed to receive Christ. And then I did a prayer ministry line, had anointing oil with me, and many of them then all came in a line to receive prayer. And I anointed them with oil and had prophetic words for various ones of them. And some of them were weeping. I remember one woman clinging to me like a drowning person to a life raft. And one woman, just said, I've never known church like this. She said, obviously, she'd gone to Catholic Mass a few times. And I just said, this is church as it was always intended to be. It was encounter. It was amazing. And so it was an extraordinary time, and one that one of the best things I've ever done. I'm thinking of going every year, and taking a band of evangelists with me, because I mentor about 60 people, and a number of those that I mentor are evangelists. And I thought maybe every year do it as a week-long trip. And then what I could do is train these evangelists by the side of the road, as in just like Jesus did, sat around in the open air training. Yeah. Then we can lead people to Christ, and then get them to lead people to Christ, and then debrief. And it would be so New Testament, unlike the seminary where I used to teach. Sorry, I shouldn't say. No hard feelings.
No. Hey, listen, I know I've got more questions, but I know there's so many more stories. But time has run out. Listen, you were released from your former position. You were then offered a gazillion jobs, but you've turned down all sorts, and you've ended up setting up. Tell us about it.
Yeah. So got made redundant from my last job because of COVID, financial crisis hit, and Wycliffe Hall decided, this is what they said to me, which position could we most do without? We know the missiologist, the teacher of mission. Anyway, that was their choice. But God was kind in it. As you say, got offered lots of job offers, 7 in America, very nearly took one in America. But then a benefactor, shall I say, came forward and offered to underwrite for me to be an itinerant evangelist based in England. And the amazing thing there was this person, it was their wife actually, they passed a church called St. Gregory the Great, and they felt that the Lord gave them a prophetic word and said, Gregory Downs needs your help financially, because they are great givers, these people. And then they sensed the Lord say, he is a type of Gregory the Great. Well, they got this prophetic word the day before they found out that I'd been made redundant. So it was not based on the fact they knew I'd been made redundant. Mm-hmm. They found out the day before. And then he said to me, she said to me, the wife, she said, what is, I don't understand the second bit. What's Gregory the Great got to do with it? And I don't know. And I said, well, if you Google it, Gregory the Great, they call him the Apostle to the English. He never came personally, but he sent Augustine of Canterbury in 597 to convert the English. And so it all tied in. And so I felt to take one of the American jobs, by the way, which would have given me a lot more money. I was offered a huge amount of money. I said to my wife, Tammy, I said, this would be an act of disobedience. And so, of course, we didn't do it. So I set up Kingfisher Ministries. It's started from January the 1st. I've taken a half pay cut, and so, looking for hopefully for people to sow into this thing, particularly hopefully so I can have a PA eventually. I'm a nightmare without a PA, and I still can't afford one. But anyway, it's set me free to do 4 things. 1, evangelism. 2, training the church in evangelism. That's all Christians. 3, raise up an army of evangelists. That's the Ephesians 4:11 specialists. And 4, mentor, coach leaders. And so that's what I'm doing with my time, and it's taken off from straight away. Far more invitations than I can cope with. Going all over the place, training in evangelism and also doing evangelism in England and overseas, and just loving it, seeing people come to Christ every week. Yeah. Just the last one very quickly. I preached at my home church this Sunday, just gone, and it was a baptism service, and we saw 5 people come to Christ afterwards. And then afterwards there was a garden party for the Compassion Outreach, and they got me doing a kind of a magic show and puppetry and all this kind of stuff, weaving in the gospel. And there was a lady there who gave her life to Christ and was filled with the Spirit, and that was just on Sunday just gone. So it's wonderful just seeing these things all the time, every week. And I'm thinking, gosh, why didn't I do it years ago? I actually feel set free from, dare I say, the institution. I'm an ordained priest in the Church of England, full respect for those who work within that church. I don't believe God's finished with it yet, although we've got great problems in terms of the liberal trajectory the church is on, sadly. But nonetheless, for me personally, have this Ephesians 4:11 call of the evangelist, and I feel set free to use it in a way I've not been able to do hitherto. So really thrilled.
And Pro, I respect you so much and cheering you on all the way. Listen, you just said you got too many invitations. Maybe you don't want people to be able to track you down, but if people wanted to be in touch with you or sow into your ministry, quick details.
Thanks very much. I can be contacted at info@kingfisherministries.org if people want to sow into the ministry, or indeed invite me to come and speak.
Brilliant. Greg, it's been fantastic. Love you, love what you do. Keep it up. We'll be cheering you on, and hopefully another several thousand people will be cheering you on. Guys, if you've enjoyed it, which I'm sure you have, if you've been inspired, please give us a great review on iTunes or Spotify. If you want to be in touch with me, it's simongilbo.com or any of the other social media platforms. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing and Mike Sandyman for the mixing. Next week, we've got another fantastic guest, so have a great week in the meantime, and look forward to seeing you next week. All right, toodaloo.